BMW's design has been in the funk for a few years now. Sure, there are a few winners, but for the most part, their cars range anywhere from decent to questionable to put that thing back where it came from or so help me. Regardless of how you think they look, we can at least say that they're a cohesive unit. There's the distinctive kidney grille stretched out between the headlights. It's usually darkened and has a helping of chrome trim. The headlights themselves have an effect that resembles a halo. Its execution varies from car to car, but it's featured on each of them. On the side, we have the Hofmeister Kink. The quarter window kicks back toward the front of the car. This creates a weighty C-pillar and hints at the rear drive configuration that the car may or may not possess. Coming around to the rear, we spot one more unifying detail, the L-shaped taillights. Once again, it varies from car to car. It ducks under more aggressively on newer models like the 3 and 7, though most of their lineup still sports a toned-down version. You can find traces of the singular elements throughout the industry. When grouped together, however, you have yourself a design language that's distinctly BMW. One that separates itself from the pack. One that has stood the test of time, though it hasn't always been like this. The BMW look has been developing for decades, and there was a time when BMWs didn't look like BMWs. What did they look like back then? Who spearheaded its development? And most importantly, how did we get from here to here? This is the evolution of BMW design. This is part 1 of a 3-part series on BMW. It was inspired by a comet left by Maganalic space clouds. This is a long video, so I've placed timestamps in the description, as well as in the pinned comment titled Notes. As always, if you have suggestions for videos, then feel free to leave them in the comments down below. The aesthetic and history of BMW are intertwined. In order to really understand their look, we need to delve into the fire in which it was forged. Thus, we go back. Before the kidney grille and Hofmeister Kink, before automobiles and motorcycles, even before BMW itself. You could point to numerous dates as the company's founding. BMW themselves points to 1916, though we'll be going back to 1913. This was the year that ex-Daimler engineer Karl Rapp established Rapp Motor & Work. The company built aircraft engines and initially got off to a hot start. When the Great War broke out in 1914, Rapp Motor & Work was one of the companies the German militia ordered engines from. Other companies released engines that were more refined. Rapp updated their existing engines to keep pace, but these modifications only sent harsh vibrations throughout their planes. Germany looked elsewhere for the engines, and any momentum the company had stopped dead on its tracks. They lured Max Frisch away from Daimler, who turned out to be the driving force behind their product renaissance. He wanted to make an engine that excelled at high-altitude flying. This product got them a contract, the terms of which forced Karl Rapp out of the company. Soon after, the company changed its name to Bayerische Motor & Work, or BMW for short. Also in 1917, Frisch's engine was released as the BMW 3A. The 3A was renowned for its fuel efficiency and composure at high altitudes. The German army commissioned about 3,000 of them. BMW was soaring higher than ever, but it all came crashing down. Germany lost the war and signed the Treaty of Versailles, which banned the production of aircraft and aircraft engines. BMW's main business was taken from under them. After the treaty, they were purchased by Knorr Bremse AG in 1920 and pivoted from aero engines to just about everything else. The company manufactured everything from household items and railway brakes to engines for motorcycles, trucks, and a variety of other applications. In an effort to streamline their operations, Knorr Bremse sold the company to Camillo Castiglione, who combined it with a struggling Bayerische Flugzeugwerk. BFW was a struggling aircraft company founded in 1916 that was hit especially hard by the treaty. Castiglione transferred engine production, the workforce, production facilities, the company name, and the logo to BFW. The companies essentially merged together, and the resulting company is BMW as we know them today. The first product was the R32, released in 1923. No, not that R32. This was essentially a redesign of the BFW Helios with the BMW Rondo slapped on it. The R32 found success and gave BMW a chance to serve the market. BMW didn't get into producing automobiles until 1928, when they purchased Fahrzeugfabrik Eisenach. FE was a manufacturer that produced cars under the Dixie moniker since 1904. They were going through rough financial waters in the late 20s and had to resort to building a licensed variant of the Austin 7. Their version was called the Dixie DA1 315. When BMW bought FE, the car still carried the Dixie in the name, but this was dropped after they updated the car. After that, the cars went by BMW 315 PS. BMW, a brand with some of the most recognizable and imitated design elements in the industry, started out by building someone else's car. The Dixie was replaced by a car of their own design in 1932. In more ways than one, the 320 was a far cry from what we tend to associate with the company today. It's a BMW, but the derivative styling lacks any of the elements they make use of currently. Its position on the market was more indicative of where they were at the time. These days, we might associate the brand with performance and luxury, but back then they wouldn't even sniff these aspirations. They were known for their motorcycles more than anything else. The only car they've had their name attached to was a rebadged Austin 7. Combine this with the Great Depression that's strangling Europe, and it's little surprise to see that the 320 occupied a similar space. BMW showed that they wanted to move up the ladder with their next car. The 303 went on sale in April of 1933. Here's the first instance of the kidney grille. In contrast with how it's used today, the grille is a large, dominating vertical element. BMW's upscale ambitions would be reflected in their generous amounts of brightwork used in this area. Most cars had a mesh insert, but a few versions would swap this out for vertical forks. The 315 replaced it after 1 year and darkened parts of the grille to add a touch of sporting character. The 315 one and 319 one took this a step further and also aggressively raked the grille at the front end. The next development came in 1936 with the introduction of the 326. The grille is still vertical, but it's smaller and now conforms to the car's streamlined bodywork. The kidneys ought to get closer together. The chrome strip bisecting them gets thicker and makes it seem like they're connected. We also see the first use of horizontal forks in the grille, which neutralizes the vertical energy. On the side, we see the debut of another iconic, though sparingly used feature. There's an oblong intake just below the hood, carrying the same texture as the grille. This generation of cars ushered in BMW's most complete lineup to date. The compact 321 and aforementioned 326 midsizer gave them coverage in mainstream segments, while enthusiasts could choose between the 327 Grand Tourer and 328 Sports Roadster. The crowning jewel in their catalog was the 1939 335. This was the first serious attempt at real luxury. Just over a decade ago, the company was pushing a warmed-over Austin 7, and now they wanted to sell people on a range-topping luxury barge. The real question was it worth it? And had a case. The 325 came equipped with the brand's most powerful 6-cylinder yet. It had 90 horsepower and could reach speeds of up to 90 miles an hour. In the end, it never got the chance to prove itself in the market. World War II broke out. BMW turned its attention back to aircraft, halting production on the 335 and all of their other models in 1941. The company put all of its resources into the war effort, buying up every planted company they could to meet demand. Many of their factories were destroyed in bombings afterwards, and the ones that weren't were either occupied by the Allies or fell under Soviet control. Once again, BMW was back at one. Because they made engines for the German militia, the Allies classified them as an armaments company. They dismantled the machines at their factories in Munich and Alich, and shipped the parts around the world as reparations. Additionally, BMW temporarily lost control of a few of their plants. The factory in Alich, for instance, wouldn't be returned to them until 1955. Possibly more damning was that they were outright banned from manufacturing aircraft, motorcycles, or cars. Meanwhile, their factory in East Germany was seized by the Soviet Autowelo company. Production of several of their models reset, starting with the 321 in 1945. These cars weren't officially being produced by BMW themselves, yet still bore their name and emblem. BMW sued them in 1952, which prompted a name change to EMW. One of the only factories they did have was a husk in Munich that had been picked clean by the Allies. Not ideal, but it's what they had to work with. Much like after the First Great War, the company manufactured everything they could to stay afloat. Pots and pans, bicycles, farm equipment, you name it. The manufacturing ban was lifted, at least for the motorcycles, in 1947, and BMW released their first bike since the war, the R24. This was actually a reverse-engineered version of the pre-war R23. Nevertheless, the company was finding its footing once again. As the ban on automobiles cleared, the company worked on a plan of attack. They still lacked the infrastructure needed to manufacture cars at the scale they'd been at before the war. They considered a number of options, including licensing a car from another manufacturer and getting into the city car segment. Ultimately, they decided to try and break into the luxury market once again. This option didn't require them to build very many cars, and if successful, they'd be able to have a higher profit margin on them. Their first post-war car was designed by the newly positioned Chief of Design, Peter Szymanowski. He'd been with the company since before the war, where he helped design a 328, 319, and 326, and returned to the company in 1948. The company also commissioned design house Pininfarina for a design, but rejected it. They felt it looked too similar to the Alfa Romeo 1900, a car they also pinned, and feared the contemporary elements it made use of would age poorly in the coming years. Instead, they doubled down on their pre-war design language when other companies hopped on styling trends of the early 50s and fully committed to Szymanowski's proposal. The 501 was a decent effort, though it never quite lived up to the mighty 335. It was nicknamed Baroque Angel for its flowing bodywork. The grille is quite similar to what they were doing before the war. The biggest developments here are the flanks beside the kidneys on each side. The car costs 15,000 mark, which is 4 times the average salary in Germany. It was also much heavier than initially anticipated, weighing in at nearly 3,000 pounds. The case for the car weakened further when compared to the cars BMW tried to compete with. The Mercedes-Benz W187 started at just under 12,000 mark, was quicker, and soaked up a lot of the potential customer base by coming out more than a year earlier. The car at least addressed its performance woes with the addition of a V8 in 1954. In its vanilla iteration, it put out 100 horsepower, significantly more than the base engine, but this still didn't improve sales. Fewer than 200 were sold in its first year. Despite this, BMW still had faith in their new direction. The company was mulling future products that would supplement the 501 when importer Max Hoffmann approached them with a proposal. He felt the 501's underpinnings and their V8 engine would be perfect for a sports car. This inclination wasn't unfounded. Hoffmann was responsible for convincing Mercedes-Benz the viability of the 300 SL and also persuaded Porsche to construct the 356 Speedster. Both cars were quite successful in the American market, and he could also point to other European cars that he brought over. BMW figured a sports car was the best way to make headway there. They greenlit the project and assigned engineer Ernst Luthe to style it. This wouldn't last very long. The company went through several of his designs before eventually taking him off the project. This gave Hoffmann the chance to give an old friend the opportunity of a lifetime. Albrecht von Gort was born in Germany on January 12, 1914. He worked as a bank clerk, but immigrated to the US in 1936. In 1938, he opened up a shop in Los Angeles, where he specialized in modifying Ford Model A's and B's. It was here that he constructed its Paragon sports car. Gort designed it, and a nearby shop helped affix the body on a Mercury chassis. You can clearly see traces of the donor car, but the finished product has his fingerprints all over it. By far the most distinctive element here is the curiously curved window. The Paragon made the rounds in the auto show circuit, debuting at the San Francisco World's Fair and the World's Exhibition in New York. He closed up shop in 1940 to enlist in the Army, but returned stateside 5 years later. He drove the Paragon up to New York City, where a chance encounter would take him on an entirely new path in his career. While in the parking lot of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, Gort stepped out of the Paragon to inspect the car in front of him. The man in the other car did the same. Who was this guy? Oh, no one special, just Raymond friggin' Loewy, industrial design extraordinaire. They spoke for a while, and by the end of it, Loewy offered Gortz a job in a studio in Indiana designing Studebakers. Gortz eventually grew out of this and established a practice of his own in 1952. Gortz Industrial Design Incorporated did everything from clocks and refrigerators to cameras and fountain pens. He became acquainted with Hoffmann in 1952, and when it came time to start working BMW's 501-based sports car, he didn't hesitate to call his friend up. He encouraged Gortz to send a proposal of his own to the company. He did, and BMW commissioned him to design 2 cars, a touring car in the vein of the 328, and a roadster inspired by the 329. The project was put on the fast track. It only took 18 months for the latter to get from sketch to prototype. The BMW 507 made its debut in 1955 at the Waldorf Astoria. This is the first instance of the kidneys being used as a predominantly horizontal element. It dominates very much like ones from models built before the war. The grille is such an integral part of the design, so it's a bit of a surprise to learn that the project went like a fair bit with something entirely different. Luthe submitted a few proposals, including this one. It's decent overall, though it's too detached from the brand's historic design language. Even if the Gortz took over, the styling was to go in a different direction as seen by the sketch. The grille takes up a lot less real estate, It's much more angular than its earlier iterations, and also slopes down on the outside edges, giving it a more aggressive look. It's the same story for the side air intake. In the sketch, the feature floats out of the front wheel well, cuts down at an acute angle before reaching the door line, and returns to the wheel. This is toned down in the production car. It's detached entirely from the wheel. The blades inside cut down at an angle, changing the dynamic of the entire element depending where you look at it from. The 503, its coupe counterpart, made its debut later that year at the Frankfurt Motor Show. This car is a bit more conservatively styled, so there aren't as many design developments. The front end has a similar layout to the 502, with the downsized kidneys being flanked by intakes on either side. Around back, we see a set of tail fins sticking out from the deck, an obvious sign of BMW's eagerness to appeal to the American market. The cars were a watershed moment for the company design-wise, though their time on sale was another story. The first bad omen came before they were even released. Despite being shown to the public in 1955, Blades pushed production back to late 1956. When they did finally launch, the cars had a surprise that Hoffman was not expecting. Back when the 507 project was in its infancy, he theorized that BMW could sell 5,000 cars annually, with the caveat that they cost $5,000. It carried a sticker price of over $10,000, more than twice what he was anticipating. This crippled its customer base and pushed it out of its intended segment. The Jaguar XK140, for example, was a fraction of the price and had 195 horsepower compared to the 507's 165. Mercedes released a 300 SL Roadster in 1957 and beat the 507 in every conceivable measure. At a price of just under $11,000, the car had 215 horsepower, could go from 0 to 60 in about 9 seconds, and reach a top speed of 146 miles an hour. The car was a miserable failure. BMW only built 252 examples over 4 years, and the United States, thought to be its biggest market, saw just 39 cars reach its shores. It's a wonder how it made it in 1960. Even at the exorbitant price, they still managed to lose money on each one sold. The catastrophic failure of the sports cars and mediocre performance of the 501 sent BMW spiraling, though things could have been worse if it weren't for the Barchetta. The company picked up a license to manufacture the car in 1955. It didn't really fit into the upscale image they were trying to push at the time, but this didn't matter much to consumers. Through 1962, they were able to move 162,000 of them. Even still, BMW found themselves in a vicious cycle. They didn't see a large enough margin to see the city car segment as a long-term viable option, and didn't sell enough luxury cars to get their investment back. The company saw the gaping hole in their lineup and started work on something that would have a wider customer base. The BMW 700 was envisioned as a rear-engine compact coupe that would do well in Europe's recovering economy, but there was a chance it wouldn't even reach production. BMW was at serious risk of losing its independence. American Motors, Daimler-Benz, and the Roots Group all had takeover bids on the table. The Daimler one in particular was especially close to happening. It didn't, and there were varying accounts on why it didn't go through. One states that the board seriously considered accepting the offer. They presented the idea to their shareholders, who soundly rejected it. The other, more hilarious one says that accountants placed the entire development cost of the car into 1 year instead of properly spreading it out across multiple years. It painted an even worse picture once corrected, and scared off many of the company's suitors. This mistake pushed BMW stock off a cliff, which allowed for shareholder Herbert Quandt to up his stake from 30% to 50%. At any rate, the company's immediate future was clear. The 700 was shown later in 1959 and gathered 25,000 orders at the show. Its eventual success helped give BMW the confidence and resources to develop a car that would further close the gap in its lineup. Nearly 1 million people were able to lay eyes on BMW's new car at the 1961 Frankfurt Auto Show, the 1500. The front end carries a completely reimagined grille area. The vertical section now takes priority in both design and functionality. It handles the bulk of the cooling and stretches from end to end, only letting up for the kidneys. Here they're little more than decoration. The story goes that Quandt laid eyes upon a proposal in the studio, one with a different front fascia that didn't require the kidneys. He simply wouldn't have it. The feature survived the Second World War and countless scrapes with disaster. In his eyes, there wasn't any reason not to bring them into the new era. Designers whipped something up to appease them, and it shows. For as revolutionary as the 1500 was, developments on this front were lacking. It's as if they just took the grille from the 503, shrunk it, and merged the two pieces into one. Regardless, this entire arrangement will set the template for the next few decades. The surfacing is a clean break from the Baroque Angel 501. It makes heavy use of orthogonal lines, with its flat roof and clearly defined three-box architecture. This is also echoed on its lines. The most prominent one finds a way to land on the entire body. It separates the car's face from its hood up front, goes through both door handles on the side, and establishes the boot at the rear. BMW seemed especially proud of it. The car debuted with bright work lining it starting around the rear wheel, and it wasn't uncommon to see versions with the entire thing encased in chrome. One feature stands out from the other straight edges. The window line kicks forward right before it meets the sill. This didn't have a name when it debuted all those years ago, but enthusiasts in the following decades have dubbed it the Hofmeister Kink, named after Wilhelm Hofmeister, the main creative force behind the 1500 styling. It might have his name attached to it, but this isn't the first time it's shown up on the car. The shape goes as far back as 1951 at least with the Kaiser Deluxe. That company went under in 1953, while BMW will live on and apply to the 1500 and all of its derivatives. It extends the daylight opening, firmly plants the roofline, and helps strengthen the car's structural integrity. The other pillars are thin and don't provide much in the way of support, so the thicker C-pillar makes up the difference. The 1500 was unveiled alongside the 3200 CS, the successor to BMW's failed Halo cars. It features a more extreme example of the kink, and judging by the pillars, the car surely needs it. The company experimented with placing the roundel here, but this wouldn't catch on. Its kidneys are inspired by the 507. They sink into the body, and the outer edges slope down at an angle. Under Hofmeister, we see the next evolution of the front grille. BMW shortened the wheelbase of the new class in 1966, giving way to the compact O2 line. Versions of these cars experimented with removing a lot of the chrome trim from the front and joining both main grille sections. This creates a seemingly unbroken horizontal line, with the kidneys poking out at the top and bottom. BMW finally found its riches with the mainstream new class, though they wanted to replace the aging line with more luxurious offerings. The first of these future products was envisioned as a direct successor to the 1500. Development would commence without their chief designer. Hofmeister resigned in 1970. His replacement would be French-born Paul Bracq. Bracq was a product of renowned fine art school École Boulle, and was able to step into an assistant's role at the design studio of the famous Philippe Charbonneau. He pitched in on a number of projects, including the Pathé Marconi promotional music truck and the Citroën presidential limousine. He became a valuable contributor in the studio, and the histories of two brands would have likely been rewritten had he not been drafted in 1954. The French Air Force stationed Bracq in Germany, where he was responsible for maintaining staff cars at Mercedes. He was dispatched to the headquarters to work on one. While he was there, he took the opportunity to ask about some Grand Prix posters. One thing led to another, and soon enough he found himself showing his sketches to lead engineer Carl Wilford. He was so impressed that he agreed to hire Bracq after his service. Bracq was officially brought on board in 1957, initially as a mere stylist, though he'd quickly move up in the ranks. Under his watch, the brand stripped away some of the more frivolous elements prevalent in the Claus era, moving into a more purposeful, utilitarian design language. Let's compare the 114 to the 110 that came before it. The car had a stronger, more straight-edged front end. The circular headlights have been swapped out for vertical ones. The edges of the grille are more defined, and the indicators have been integrated into the main unit. The body of the car eliminates the other superfluous elements, and prioritizes a single line. Perhaps its most iconic Mercedes project is the 230 SL Pagoda, defined by its massive greenhouse and tapered C-pillar. Bracq left the company in 1967 to become the head designer of Brizonneau and Lotz. It was here that he had his first contact with BMW. They contracted the company to design yet another sports coupe for the American market. This project was eventually cancelled, though we can get a peek of what he had to offer for the brand. He left B&L in 1970 and went to BMW to take over for Hofmeister. His first project was the turbo concept car, which debuted at the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich. Believe it or not, the car is based on the humble 2002. This project took just 6 months to finish. It has a set of pop-up headlights, but still manages to sport a version of BMW's corporate face. The kidneys poke out from the rest of the body and create a raised section on the hood. On the side, we can see one of Braqq's trademark elements from his time at BMW, the guard strip. It begins above the grille, trails the beltline on the side, and wraps around under the lights. The rear end features satisfyingly smooth buttresses. and a set of emblems at either side. The turbo was also a testbed for a number of safety technologies. There's a visible gap between the bumpers and the rest of the body. BMW calls these deformation zones. They absorb the impact of a crash, sparing the headlights and other mechanicals, and they're made of a material that allows them to pop back into their original form. Other highlights include a wraparound roll bar and a suite of collision prevention sensors. Lastly, the interior has all of the controls tilted towards the operator, emphasizing its driver-focused character. The long-awaited new class successor also debuted in 1972. It was his first effort to see production, and although it appears to merely build upon a foundation that Hofmeister made, it's a Bracq design through and through. Let's start with the character line. It's still there, but it's not as loud as on the 1500. The door guards essentially replace the supporting line of the new class that started at the center of the headlamp. It doesn't slope up the body like the turbo, but it still creates a sense of continuity in the design. The wheel arches around it and flare up more aggressively. The one surprising carryover is the trim that spills off the window. This goes into a line on the C-pillar that strengthens the three-box architecture and goes down onto the boot. The profile has a sort of wedge shape. The hood has to angle up to reach the cabin, and the rear end slopes down. It's obvious when lined up next to the button-down E3. The E23 7 Series would add a few things. The blinkers moves up from the bumper to the grille. The kidneys push up against the hood. The inner bulb is smaller than the outer one, making the grille appear larger than it really is. Lastly, the E21 brought the driver-oriented cockpit to the production cars. In just 4 years at the helm, Paul Bracq laid the styling of some of the most iconic cars in BMW's history and further honed their design language. After 2 stints in Germany, he longed to return to his home country, so he left the company in 1974 to work for Peugeot. When he started at BMW, the company was still trying to set their look in stone, and when he left, it didn't seem as if there was anywhere left to take it. The man set to replace Bracq would have a difficult time bringing them into a new era. Luckily, BMW was able to snag an inventive designer from a competitor. Claus Luthe originally wanted to follow his brother into the architecture field, but an apprenticeship at a coach builder sent him on a new path. He spent the years between 1948 and 1954 at Carrosseria Bauer Vol, working on bus designs. Not the most exciting stuff, so he didn't hesitate to leave when a position in Fiat's German subsidiary opened up. They had him on the Necker line. The origins of this company are a bit confusing and well outside the scope of this video, but at this point, they were rebodying Fiat for the German market. Slightly more invigorating than his previous position, but just barely. The true benefit of working for the company was the connections he'd be able to make. One such connection was the NSU, a brand that at that point was known for the motorcycles. They re-entered the passenger car market in 1957 with the Prinz, a quirky though largely unremarkable compact. This was something to build on for NSU. A year after launching the Prinz, they released a sporty Breton-designed coupe to accompany it. The company planned an aggressive product offensive and wanted Luthe to help shape it. He joined the company in 1958, and his first project was the Prinz 4, a significant update to the car released in 1961. It was around this time that NSU acquired a license to develop a rotary engine. Now, there's something unusual about this. Many companies took a chance on the technology. What is unusual is that they actually managed to bring a rotary-powered car to market. The Luthe-styled Spider was released in 1964, making it the first rotary-powered car to ever reach production. NSU jumped the gun, both in rotaries and the next car. Despite only getting into the passenger car market a decade ago, they felt that they were ready to take on established luxury brands. Their next car was envisioned as an executive sedan that would go up against cars like the BMW E3. Powering it would be their trusty rotary. NSU had invested heavily in them, and they felt they'd give them an edge over the competition. You could tell the 1967 RO80 was ahead of its time from just looking at it. It was one of the most aerodynamic cars of its day when it was released, with some models carrying a drag coefficient of just 0.34. This was achieved without extensive wind tunnel testing. NSU didn't even take it there until near the end of development, and even then they managed to 0.36. Its rounded styling made competitors look dated by comparison. It didn't resonate with people at the time, but automakers would follow suit many years later. This would be NSU's swan song. The rotary engine, the thing they thought would set them apart, became their undoing. Rotaries put a massive amount of stress on their components, and NSU used parts that simply didn't hold up. It wasn't uncommon for engines to fail after 15,000 miles. The company replaced them at a great cost, putting them in a financially precarious situation. Up until this point, NSU's journey has had a few parallels with BMW's. Both are pretty old companies that ran into trouble after the war. Both produced motorcycles to keep the lights on, and both had their sights set on the luxury segment. This is where the similarities end. While BMW finally broke through despite everything going against them, NSU flew too close to the sun and burned out. Just 2 years after the car came out, the company was purchased by Volkswagen and merged into Audi. They weren't interested in the RO80 or the rotary engines. Volkswagen wanted the car NSU was developing. This was to be a more conventional sedan with a piston engine. It would see the light of day, not as an NSU, but as the Volkswagen K70. Volkswagen also named Luthe Audi's chief of design. His work here includes the aforementioned K70 and the Audi 50. He joined BMW in 1976 and quickly placed more emphasis on design. There were 30 people in the design department under Bracq, and he added another 70, bringing the total up to 100. After refreshing the E12 to bring it in line with the other cars, he was assigned to design a successor. He has more creative freedom here than he ever did at Audi. People were anxiously awaiting the car's reveal. It finally showed up in 1981 and... The E28 could be easily mistaken for a mere styling update, but there is more going on than meets the eye. The inner bulb is smaller than the outer one, like it is on the E23, which makes the grille feel larger. The kidneys have been split into two pieces again, and the hood detailing has been toned down. The side reinforces the elements from the E12, as the wind-determined character line make a return. The biggest design development here is around back. While the familiar L shape starts to take form, people at the time were expecting a more substantial redesign, and were disappointed with Luthe's evolutionary approach. When asked about it by BMW Car, Luthe said, "We do not have to create models that are radically different from the ones they replace. To maintain our tradition, we do not need to design way out designs. The important thing to keep in mind is to make sure there is continuity from the old model to the new model." The E33 series epitomizes the statement. It builds off the cars that came before, refining the formula just enough to further evolve their design language. This model takes it to heights never seen before and rarely seen since. Most everything up front is arranged horizontally, stretching the car out and giving it way more presence than it ought to have. Even the circular headlights contribute to this. Although they're circles, them being the same size and on the same plane makes them feel rectangular. The blinker has been integrated into the guard, allowing the lights to stretch across the car even further. It's dangerous the closer the fog lights, but the guard is so powerful that it breaks them up and brings the blinker along on its level. All the kidneys need to do to stand out is to sit up straight. The side of the car is a mix of new class and E12. The shark nose is still present, but the wet shape is toned down at the hood and nearly non-existent past the C-pillar. The kink is a bit more subdued as well. It isn't working as hard as it did on the E21 because of the other contrasting lines. The rear of the car isn't dramatically different, though we do see the license plate area move in between the lights and out of the way of the guard. The gradual evolution continued with subsequent models. The E32 is the first car to fully commit to L-shaped lights in the back. The blinkers stack atop of the main units, giving the character line a place to live. They even give the panel gaps on the trunk to play along. This is also where we see the depreciation of the outer grille. It hardly has any room to breathe. The headlights appear larger because they actually extend out of the edge they create. The kidneys also get larger, though customers could opt to shrink these down. On the E34, it's completely broken off from the kidneys and only serves to contrast against the headlights. It was done away with entirely with the E36. It's supplanted by even wider kidneys and headlights tucked behind glass. Luthe has had a say in many of their cars in these years, but the most unusual was completely out of his hands. The company established BMW Technik in 1985. Think of this as an advanced design studio, where some of their top talent are freed from the constraints of a typical workspace. They brought in 60 of their own people, and lured away Porsche chief of design Ulrich Spins away to lead the team. Despite being founded to toy with experimental production methods, Technik actually looked to the past for their first major project. It had been 25 years since the last 507 left the factory, and in its anniversary year, it was decided to break ground on a spiritual successor on the now legendary car. They had a mock-up to show to management 6 months later. The board loved the car so much that they gave it the go-ahead. A running prototype was completed a year later, and the company had a production spec car ready for the 1987 Frankfurt Motor Show. The car was a hit. It made such an impression that a German car magazine offered BMW $150,000 for the car on the stand. They couldn't do it even if they wanted to, seeing as how they needed it for testing. The BMW Z1 finally entered production in the autumn of 1988. It was a test bed for several bizarre elements, but the strangest of them has to be its doors. Press the big silver button, and the door retracts into the sill. It almost looks like magic, but BMW has an explanation. The mechanism for the doors and side windows are driven by 2 electric motors in the tooth belt. The motors incorporated the freewheel function to allow the doors and windows to be operated manually if necessary, to avoid burdening the actual door with additional weight. All of the electrical and mechanical components were integrated into the car's body. A double mechanical lock acting on the doors in both open and closed position prevented rattling noise and excessive door movement while driving. The side windows could, of course, be lowered separately from the doors. After the doors had been opened and closed again, the windows automatically returned to their previous position. The entire exterior of the car is composed of plastic panels that are bolted into place. BMW actually sold sets of these panels separately and encouraged owners to swap them out to change the color of their cars. They claimed it could be done in under an hour with just a simple screwdriver, which I seriously doubt. Just look at this mess. Its lead designer was Harm Legay. Prior to the stint at BMW, Legay contributed to the 924 at Porsche and managed Ford Design Studio in Cologne, Germany, where he styled the Sierra. He's given the Z1 a touch of the Sierra's era-dictated design. The main contributor to this actually lies under the car. Its underbody is flat from the front end to the rear axle, where the body raises up to direct air through to the diffuser. Other elements, like the flush headlights, combine for a CD of 0.36 with the roof up and 0.43 with the roof down. The Z1 was a marvel of design, but BMW had one final car planned before saying farewell in the 80s. Remember when I said the E30 took the brand to places it's only rarely been since? Well, the E31 is one of those rare peaks. The car blends BMW's heritage and Luthe's forward-thinking philosophy. It was one of the first cars in the industry to be shipped with computer-aided design tools. As a result, it was one of the most aerodynamic production cars on sale when it was released, with a CD of 0.29. Engineers were able to achieve this by using retractable headlamps, tucking the windshield wipers under the hood, and optimizing the shape of the rearview mirrors. The nose of the car borrows heavily from the 1972 Turbo, from the small kidneys and wide flanks to a panel gap inspired by its deformation zone. The gap goes through the flank and continues into the thinnest guard to date. It also borrows the fender flares from the E30 M3. The profile of the car is highlighted by wonderful pillarless windows. It doesn't have a B-pillar, so when the windows are rolled down, you get a silhouette that follows the roof unimpeded. The car went on sale in 1989, but tragedy would strike the Luthe family not long after. On Good Friday, April 13, 1990, Claus fatally stabbed his son. He was convicted of manslaughter and served only a portion of his 33-month sentence. BMW offered Luthe his position at the company back, though he instead opted for an early retirement. And although he was brought back in a consultancy role in 1992, his tenure as head of design and BMW's golden era came to an end. Chris Meyer replaced him in 92, ushering in a new chapter in their history. I actually made a video on him in the past, but I don't feel as if I went into as much detail on the matter as I could have. I'm currently working on a revised version, but if you're still curious, then there'll be a link for the current one in the description. Thanks for watching.